What if Adele was a 1920s jug band singer? That's the unlikely scenario we'll be unpacking on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name's Morgan Brown, and each week I upload a new What If videos in my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just Garage Band and whatever instruments I have lying around my flat in order to try and create this alternative version that I've imagined. So this week, the song I picked was Rolling in the Deep by Adele, and I attempted to turn that into a 1920s style jug band blues song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I have a feeling that this video might annoy some people. I know Adele's massively popular, has loads of very dedicated fans. So just before I start, I want to apologise for any offence that I might accidentally cause to any of those people. I'm not someone who makes videos in order to put across controversial hot takes or anything, but just to get it out of the way, I'm not a massive Adele fan myself. I've got a couple of issues with her. I'm not saying in any way that she's not tremendously talented. Obviously, she's hugely successful, has an absolutely fantastic voice, incredible tone. There's just a couple of things that have always slightly wound me up about her. It's not really necessarily issues with Adele herself, it's more general issues with popular culture really, but just because Adele is so successful, she seems to really particularly exemplify those things. To some extent, some of this might just be my own personal bugbears. Some of it might be justified. I don't know. You tell me. I'm sure you will as well. One thing in particular that I've always found quite off-putting about an Adele record every time I hear one is that although the actual singing is technically excellent, she's got a great tone, I have trouble getting past the crazy American accent that everything's sung in. We've all heard Adele talking, we know what she sounds like, we know what her speaking voice is like, and I don't see why everything has to be sung in this crazy made-up American accent. And I know that it's not just Adele who does this, it's really common, particularly among people working in the more soul and R&B type of genre, but generally across pop, I know people tend to still sing in an American accent, but I've always found Adele's to be particularly egregious. I kind of understand why back in the earlier days of rock and roll and sort of what we'd now consider to be popular music, why British acts were mimicking American accents. At first we were definitely playing catch up with American pop, and pretty much everything that's coming out was to some extent an imitation of something that had already happened in America. But I kind of feel like at this stage British popular music is many decades past that and is at its best when it has its own identity rather than just being an imitation of something that's happening across the Atlantic. I know Adele is influenced by Ella Fitzgerald, Aretha Franklin, Billie Holiday, all these greats. So you grow up listening to that, you're going to want to sing like that. But to me, soul music particularly lives or dies on the authenticity of the performance. Authenticity is a difficult term in popular music. You can argue that nothing's really authentic. It's all kind of a show to some extent. I do get that. But I think soul music especially, and yeah, I guess you'd consider Adele to be a soul artist, the whole point of it is that it's an authentic expression of someone's spirit, isn't it? Surely? You're expressing what's in your soul. And I don't personally see how I can accept someone's expression as being authentic when the accent that's coming out of their mouth is an accent that they've never spoken in their life. To me, that just adds a level of artifice that really undermines the whole performance, and I have trouble getting past that. Obviously, I'm in the minority here, so I assume I'm wrong and everyone else is right, but it seems odd to me that it's acceptable in Adele's case, but then in other cases people will call this out. For instance, it makes me think of Iggy Azalea, who was wildly successful for a little while there, but then people started to question, why is this white person who speaks with an Australian accent rapping in this completely made up other voice that she doesn't actually speak with? I think some of those accusations ended up getting quite nasty. She was definitely being accused of cultural appropriation. And I'm not saying that's right. I mean, I'm not defending Iggy Azalea. I don't think any of those records were particularly good, and I'm quite happy not having to listen to them again. But it does make me wonder, how is it offensive cultural appropriation when Iggy Azalea imitates black musicians from the 90s, but not offensive cultural appropriation when Adele imitates black performers from the 50s, 60s, 70s? Again, I'm not actually saying it's cultural appropriation. I think people get a bit too trigger happy with that accusation. I'm just saying, for me, it takes away from the quality of her voice to have everything filtered through this pretense of an American accent. And you might say it sounds ridiculous, you can't sing soul music in an English accent. I'd say I kind of feel like you probably can. I mean, Alison Moyet, I would say, is a soul singer who generally performs in an English accent and is pretty great. And also, I think people would have said the same thing about hip-hop for years, but as far as I can see, UK hip-hop has only really come into its own since British hip-hop performers stopped trying to just directly emulate American rappers and develop their own identity. And I kind of feel like if British R&B and soul singers can do that, then that's just going to take their art to a whole other level, really. So yeah, sorry if I've upset any Adele fans with that. That's just kind of the thing that always springs to mind whenever I hear her, unfortunately. Well, yeah, as I say, I'm not really an Adele hater, even though it might seem like that. She's still an incredible performer, and there's still a few songs that I think are alright, including Rolling in the Deep. And I think probably the main reason that I was drawn to that song is because although in terms of its production and delivery it's pretty contemporary sounding record for 2010, it's still basically a blues. And that kind of got me thinking how some aspects of the music industry have changed massively since its inception, and some have barely changed at all. I mean, that little blues scale is still the foundation of so much music, just as it was back in 1920 when Mamie Smith cut Crazy Blues, which was, I guess you could argue, the first real blues record. Certainly the first blues record performed by an African-American and targeted towards an African-American audience anyway. And it's interesting to look back at those early days of the recording industry and see how that came through, because I guess for a little while there, the technology was kind of outpacing the industry in a way. There was this new technology available, no one was quite sure what to use it to put out. Marching bands, barbershop quartets, comedy routines, all kinds of things that these newly formed companies were speculating audiences might enjoy. But things only really get interesting largely as a result of the work of one Ralph Peer, who was kind of a catch-all talent scout, producer, publisher, and he was probably the first guy in the music industry to recognise that recorded music had a potential audience outside just middle-class urban white people, I guess. So I think he was definitely one of the people behind arranging that recording session for Mamie Smith, which resulted in Crazy Blues, and then started the whole wave of the classic blues singers being recorded. Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, successful professional entertainers who sang blues songs as part of their touring vaudeville acts. I think with the success of those classic blues records, Pierce started to realise that there was a massive untapped market for other kinds of music that just weren't being heard in these urban centres. So he started looking to rural musicians, people who are playing folk music, people who are playing blues music, all of these, the kinds of music that were happening in rural areas that just weren't necessarily available in urban centres. And he set up field recordings in makeshift locations, just sending out basically open invites for rural musicians to come and get recorded, get paid to make a record. So these field recording sessions completely changed the landscape of American pop music. I mean, just as an example, there was one particular session that he set up in 1927 where on a single day he made the first recordings of both Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family, which basically on a single day lays the entire foundation for all of country music, which is a pretty incredible feat. But as well as that, he recorded some pivotal blues performers, pivotal folk performers, and among them the Memphis Jug Band. I think jug bands had existed in various forms for quite some time. I mean, it's quite hard to trace the murky origins of jug band music, because until it was recorded, it's not particularly well documented. But we're basically talking about groups of musicians playing sort of good time dance music with often fairly improvised lineups, sort of mixture of whatever instruments are available, guitars, banjos, mixed in with just improvised instruments from household objects that happen to be around, including jugs, which would be used to sort of replace brass instruments in the lineup, and washboards, which would be used for percussion instruments. And this is where you get things like people making basses out of tea chests, that kind of thing. And I think these bands have been around for quite some time, playing generally kind of old-time folk songs, that kind of thing. The Memphis Jug Band were probably the first band to be recorded that incorporated elements of blues into the jug band sound, so it's kind of up-tempo dance music, but it's also blues. And that's pretty important, because you could argue that's the birth of rhythm and blues. Blues not as a slow, mournful type of music, but as a communal dance music, something that is going to get a room of people jumping. And those early Memphis Jug Band recordings really kind of set the template for jug band music going forward. A lot of these Ralph Peer produced records were massively successful at the time in the mid to late 20s, sold millions of records. But then the Great Depression wiped out so much of the record industry that a lot of those performers were basically wiped out overnight, went back to whatever they were doing before, just had to go and find other work as a means to survive. It wasn't really until, I think, somewhere in the region of 1952, a guy called Harry Smith was commissioned to produce for Folkways Records and the Smithsonian an anthology of American folk music. And in order to do this, he went back to a lot of these 78s from the 20s just to try and find examples of different styles of American folk music from the very early days of the recording industry. Produced this set of, at the time, 3 albums, which initially came out to very little fanfare and no one paid that much attention, but it gradually picked up a few admirers, word of mouth got out, and eventually that collection of songs and recordings became the catalyst for the whole kind of American folk revival that went from the sort of mid-50s into the 60s and beyond. And the songs that he collected on there became the basic sort of texts of that folk revival. A lot of the performers on those records had kind of late career revivals of fortune as a result of that as well. So you get people like Mississippi John Hurt and Doc Boggs and all these great old performers who've just been living in total obscurity for 20 or 30 years, coming back out of retirement and playing to these adoring audiences of kind of college students. And off the back of that, there's also a renewed interest in jug band music as well. So you get particularly into the psychedelic era. There's a lot of nostalgia for that kind of earlier age. So you get whole new jug band groups forming, and even that being kind of hybridized with psychedelic rock. So like the 13th Floor Elevators, for instance, the great Texan psychedelic band, incorporated a jug player into their sound as well. And you know, it might not have survived into the present day as a sort of contemporary sound, but I just find it interesting how over the course of 90 years you can go from one guy with a primitive recording device in a hotel room recording people who've pretty much literally wandered in from the fields to, in 2010, Adele making this incredibly polished, perfectly pristine pop record. And at heart, they're both still stomping blues records. But yeah, so my idea for an alternative universe scenario for this week's song was basically just that in my alternative universe, instead of being born in the late 80s in Tottenham, Adele is born right at the start of the 20th century in rural Tennessee. Not much is known about her because obviously records of just rural musicians from back in those days are pretty sketchy. All we know really is that in 1927, she answered a call from Ralph Peer for rural musicians to come and record, so her and her band, Adele Adkins and the Jug Stompers, have gone into town and cut just 2 songs, one of which is Rolling in the Deep. It came out on a 78 RPM record and it was a minor local success. For whatever reason, never recorded anything else and just went back to working on a farm back in Tennessee. But then, obviously, this Obscure 78 is later rediscovered by Harry Smith when he's putting together his Smithsonian anthology, and it becomes one of the founding texts of the American folk revival. So, in attempting to turn Rolling in the Deep into a Jug Band blues song, as ever, my first step is just taking the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and getting it all synced up. I assume it's recorded to a click, so it's nice and easy to sync it to the grid. Slowed it down just a little bit to try and get a sort of easygoing Jug Band kind of dance tempo. I think the first thing that I started with was a rhythm guitar track. I wasn't going to put any drums on this because typically drums weren't part of your average Jug Band lineup, so I started out with just a basic rhythm guitar track. I wanted to keep everything pretty ramshackle and lo-fi, so I used my most beaten up acoustic guitar, which is this one. The action's terrible and it doesn't sound great. I thought that's perfect for what I'm doing here, so just played some basic folky bluesy kind of rhythm on that. Recorded straight into the computer microphone, didn't use a separate mic. I just wanted the sound of that guitar in a room being recorded not particularly well. Did the same with banjo. I'm not a great banjo player and I can only really play in G. The song's in C, so just bluffed my way through that as best I could. In terms of bass frequencies on there were a couple of things I wanted to do. I wanted to somehow mimic a T-chest bass. I don't have a T-chest bass and I wasn't about to go out and get all the bits to make one. So I just used my regular bass guitar, but I shoved a bunch of sponge under the strings to take away any sustain that they have and really kind of damp that completely. And then I just plugged it in with no amp simulator or anything. So you've got a really dead sounding bass sound. Just a little bit of note and quite a lot of just kind of low percussive thump, which is exactly what I wanted. Also covering the bass frequencies. Obviously, it being a jug band, we needed a jug sound in there. Now, I did watch a jug tutorial. I can't remember the name of the guy who did it, but I will find out what it was and I'll put it down in the description under this video because it was really cool, actually. I watched the tutorial and I was thinking, I could learn how to do this, it'll be great. But tried for about 5 minutes and realised I was just going to drive everyone crazy, like making raspberry sounds with my mouth and probably never get anywhere. So I resorted to a bit of high-tech cheating. Instead of learning to play the jug myself, I sampled one note of this tutorial and then just played the jug part in on my MIDI keyboard. So sorry for being deeply inauthentic. And I wanted just a few different bits of other textures in there as well, just to come in at various points and build the song up a little bit. So I've got a harmonica that comes in, just playing some little fills here and there. I don't have a harmonica in the right key, so I had to pretty much play it blind to a click and then pitch shift it into place, but I think it works pretty well. And I did a little bit of slide guitar using my steel string acoustic. I'm not a great slide player, but again, it's just another bluesy texture in there just to fill out the sound and create a bit of interest. And then as it goes on, I also decided to add in a kazoo, which is another fun thing that you hear occasionally in some of these jug band records. I guess if the jug's doing what a trombone might do in a jazz band, the kazoo's maybe doing more of like the trumpet part. So that's kind of rasping away in there too. Felt like it probably needed a bit of percussion as well. Obviously, as I say, you rarely hear any kind of drum in a jug band. So ideally I wanted a washboard, but I don't have a washboard, so improvised by using the slats of a wooden chair instead. Which doesn't sound particularly washboard-like, but it's not a million miles away. It's got at least a bit of that sort of ramshackle quality of a sort of washboard rhythm. To finish off the Sonic Illusion, had to do quite a bit of post-production on it this time, so overdriving things to make it sound like a mic being overloaded. I did a lot of EQing things to just push up the mid-range and take off a lot of treble and bass frequencies, so it has that kind of tinny sound that you hear on old records as well. And I also added a bit of vinyl crackle as well, just to make it sound like the recording had been sourced from a dusty old record, like most of the things on the Harry Smith anthology were, just to give it that feel of a proper uncovered old relic. Then for the video, as ever, I just started out by finding a decent performance of the song in order to make it feel feel period authentic, I put a grainy black and white filter all over it. And then to suggest that Adele has a proper jug band backing her up, I edited in some clips of a lineup of the Memphis Jug Band. So we've got them backing her up. And then mocked up a couple of photos, as I'm wont to do. I made a couple of mock-up posters and record sleeves and things, record labels, just to place Adele Adkins and her Jug Stompers back in that mid-20s time frame as well. So hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fun one to do. So let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. That always really helps. I really appreciate it. If there's anything you'd like me to attempt in coming weeks and months, any songs you'd like me to have a look at, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, or any artists you'd like me to take a look at, please do let me know. I do always take note of your suggestions. I'll try and get round to that eventually. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.